Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Revolution and Identity, 20th Century Literature in Quebec. My name is Melanie Blake, and I'm the Director of Classical Pursuits. I'm here today with Samantha Clark, the Marketing Manager at our travel partner, Worldwide Quest, and with Anne Kirkland, the founder of Classical Pursuits. Anne will be on later in the session to manage the Q&A that we'll have at the end of the lecture. So again, welcome, Happy New Year. Welcome to the return of our free lecture series. This is the first one of 2021, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. We're going to get started in just a moment. I first wanted to give you a couple of practical tips. So the two main features that for you to interact with the webinar are the audio and the questions features. You'll see either the word audio or perhaps an earphones or headphones logo. And you will also see, and you can change your volume or other audio settings there. You will also be able to ask questions by pulling up the questions tab, and you can type in your question. I'm sorry, I think somebody is texting me even though I had turned off my texts. So sorry about that. Let me just fix that real quick. Sorry, they had been turned off, and I'm not sure why they're still coming through. So my apologies. Just double check that they're all turned off. Sorry, everyone. Okay, let me just fix that. Sorry, so sorry. All right, so we're continuing with the webinar. And again, and Samantha will be here throughout the session. If you have any questions about any technical problems, please let her know, and she will do her best to help you in real time. And so let's get started. 20th century literature in Quebec. So we are doing this webinar in connection with our trip later in the year at the end of September. And we are going to, as many of you know, we may have, we have a promotion for a just $50 deposit will reserve your place on a trip. I know there's a lot of uncertainty around travel, and but we are hopeful for our late fall trips. So if this is a trip you think you might be interested in, we encourage you to put down just this little $50 deposit, or if you have any questions, we're always here to answer them. All right, Revolution and Identity. As some of you know, this is the second part in this series. In the first part, I talked about mostly literature in the 19th century. And this time I'm going to talk about the 20th century, focusing especially on the early 1900s and the 1960s and 70s with the Quiet Revolution, or la Révolution Tranquille. And I chose the title Revolution and Identity because it really targeted two of the main themes that are going to pop up. Revolution, of course, with the Quiet Revolution, and other major changes in Quebec society. You know, we always associate revolution with upheaval and change, rapid change, sometimes often turbulent or sometimes violent change. And then also revolution suggests a revolving, right? Turning around something, or returning to the same point of something. And both of those connotations are in play here, because throughout the history of literature in Quebec, both scholars and the public and politicians are focusing or revolving around this question of identity. What is Quebecois literature? And then the even larger question, what does it mean to be Quebecois? what is that identity? And it's a question that has been shifting for several centuries, well, since the arrival of Jacques Cartier in 1535 through to today. And today we're going to focus, so last time we were mostly in Quebec City. Today we're going to be a little bit more in Montreal, but not entirely. And you can see here, this is an image from St. Catherine Street in Montreal in the 1960s. And it really shows a major shift from rural to urban, which plays a large role in how people conceive of their Quebecois identity and what is Quebecois culture. And we'll talk more about that. So we have St. Catherine Street in the 60s. So let's get started. And I wanted, before we move through the 20th century, just to set a little bit of context, especially for those who were here for session one. So we have this extract from the report of the Earl of Durham, who was charged with reporting to the British Parliament on the revolutions that were taking place in the late 1830s in Upper and Lower Canada, what are now Ontario and Quebec. And what he says really sets a lot of the tone for what we're going to talk about today. And you can see here that this is the first passage is maybe one of the most quoted from his report. Of the French or the French Canadians in Lower Canada, he says, they are a people with no history and no literature. And he's saying this in part because they've been, separated in his view and the view of the British from the French by quite a number of years now, following the French loss of control of the large territories that they had in North America, and a further separation following the French Revolution. And he goes on to it's like what are you saying, man? Like, really, every other race than the English race is in a state of inferiority. It's hard, and this kind of stuff just today, it's really hard. It's hard for us to read, but it's out there. And he, in his view, the French language and the French literature, that would be French or Francophone literature that are being published or produced in Quebec, are by nature inferior. And as you can imagine, Lord Durham, if you went to school in Quebec, you definitely learned about him. Not a popular figure there. And it's hard. These ideas, they really cast a long shadow over over many years of politics, society, and culture in Quebec. And oops, sorry, I don't know what happened there. Let me go back. Oh, sorry, everyone. This is not my day for computer stuff. Sorry. Okay, let me just okay, I'm not sure what's happening. Let me just try to get back to the beginning. My apologies, everyone. Back to where we were. All right. And so we go from this idea of they are a people with no history and no literature to the founding of the magazine and also publishing house Parti Pris. And this is the first, this is one of the earlier issues, January 1965. And the editors and writers of this magazine are calling explicitly for a Québécoise littérature, Quebecois literature, and so they're asserting very very firmly that there is a Quebecois literature, and this magazine and other efforts are going to work toward it. What do they mean by Quebecois literature? And we're going to get into that when we talk more about the Révolution tranquille. They have a very set idea that is not shared by everyone. But you can see, a major difference or major shift from this report by Lord Durham through to this assertion of a Québécois literature in Parti pris. And I'm going to bring up Parti pris a little later as well. So as a quick reminder, last time we focused a lot on the Patriotic School of Quebec in the second half of the 19th century. And this is just a general overview of what they were about. Of course, it was much more nuanced than we really have time to present here. But this school, and you can see one of the founders, Octavie Crémazie, down here at the bottom, was all about, quote, traditional values, especially political conservatism, Roman Catholic beliefs, and especially in opposition to what a lot of Quebecois writers saw as a France that had become godless and materialist after the French Revolution. And there was a romanticization and a focus on rural and agricultural themes. At the same time, right, because there's always opposing forces or forces in tension. French Romanticism was an influence as well, and with an emphasis on lyricism. So, like if in a lyric poem, that's generally a short poem that's about a private and intense emotional experience. Themes of fatality and heroism, violence. So you saw the influence of writers like Victor Hugo in France. So you did have different forces coming into play, but the dominant thought was really on these traditional Quebecois values centered around a rural society and a society that is Roman Catholic. And around the turn of the century, there's a real shift, both from Quebec City to Montreal, and in some of the influences that became more prominent. So the Montreal Literary School, or École littéraire de Montréal, was founded in 1895 by two law students, Jean Charbonneau and Louvigny de Montigny, so even though they were studying law, they were very interested in asserting a Quebecois literary identity. And you can see some of the members of the society here on this postcard from around 1900. And they hosted meetings and public events around Montreal, symposium, lecture, readings, things like that, especially around the turn of the century. And they also published collections of their writing in two big volumes in 1900 and 1925. And you can see this is where they met at the Chateau Ramsay in Montreal. Some of you may have been there. It was originally I think the governor's house, a house for one of the governors, and now it's a museum. And you can see also here one of the editions of their school. You see l'École littéraire de Montréal. Oh, sorry. And they chiefly published poetry, but they also published a lot of different other kinds of writings as well. And you see a couple names here that we're going to focus on. Alfred Lozo and Émile Naligon. I'm going to talk about them in just one moment. First, and I mentioned there was kind of a shift in ideas and what were it between the Patriotic School of Quebec and the Montreal Literary School. And what was the Montreal Literary School all about? There was no single doctrine, but they were influenced by the Parnassian and symbolist movements in France. And so these were two movements from about the 1860s on. And just to give kind of a brief summary of what they were all about, a lot of the prominent ideas in these movements were art for art's sake, as opposed to what many people saw as social or political motivations in art from the Romantic period. And also a very high value placed on craft, form, and workmanship. And especially for the symbolists, use of metaphor and symbol to represent absolute truths. So poets in France like Paul Verlaine and Charles Baudelaire were associated with these movements, and they were very, very influential on some of the poets of the Montreal School. One of the best known is Émile Nelligan. As you can see, he had a very short career, 3 years, and he was kind of a youth prodigy, a poetic prodigy, but he was diagnosed, I believe, what we would now call today schizophrenia, and spent most of his pretty short life in institution. You can see a portrait of him on the left and a monument to him in Quebec on the right. We're going to take a brief look at one of his poems. This is Clair de Lune intellectuelle. And I chose this in part to show the influence. Verlaine has a the French poet Verlaine has a poem called Clair de Lune, which means moonlight. Debussy, Claude Debussy, the composer, also has a piano composition, Clair de Lune. And there's other Clair de Lune there's other French poets, a very well-known Colombian poet from the late 19th century. So this was a very popular theme at the time. And this poem is a rondeau or a rondelle, where you can see there's a very simple rhyme pattern, just 2 rhymes. So you have lointaine, antenne, profondeur, verdeur, and you have those 2 rhymes repeated throughout the poem. And then I've put in red here, in this type of poem, the first line is carried through the different verses, but Nelligan changes it a little bit. So here his thought is the color of faraway lights, and he just repeats that line. And at the end, his thought is the color of faraway golden moons. And you can kind of you can see in some of the images that he has, like a sonorous garden where you can hear the sighs of the fountains, the soupir des fontaines, or the sun, the setting sun, kind of pulling in its antennas. A lot of very vivid imagery that for these poets was meant to convey larger truths. And this poem is easily found online. There's not very many. There's a couple very rough English translations, but it's readily available at the University of Toronto website. And I'll include follow-up information where you can find all of these works of literature in my follow-up email to the webinar. And another poet I wanted to talk about from this time is Alfred Lozo. Also a relatively short life, as you can see. He was an invalid for a lot of his life. And like Nelligan, he dealt a lot with symbols that invoked all of the senses. And so this is just a small part from a poem called Bonheur, Happiness. And here you see the night or the evening envelopes us, unspeakably sweet or soft. And he's talking about and the hour of divine peace that fills the heart with joy and the mouth with honey. And he talks about being happy as if his soul was it was raining stars in his soul. So a very image heavy poem that brings in all of your senses. And if you're familiar with the poems of Baudelaire or Verlaine, you can see the influence of these images that really make you feel or see, and sometimes, you know, juxtapositions of things that are maybe graceful and elegant with things that are ugly or unpleasant, and all of that, all of those influences are being felt by these Canadian poets. And then the second major development from the Montreal School and a little bit later is again, a tension, as we saw in the Quebec School, between regionalists and exotistes, or the exotistes were sometimes called esthetes. And I represented the regionalists on one side by the Canadian painter William Brind'mer, and this is a landscape in Quebec from about 1910, with the scene of Paris from the French poet Caillebotte. And so, you know, as we saw with the Quebec School, there was a real push on regional themes and especially rural themes, agricultural themes. For many writers, they thought these were the true Quebecois subjects. The exotistes were really a minority. Many of them had studied in France and were influenced by French popular culture during the Belle Époque. But they were not given the same support as or attention from the regionalists, who were overall supported by the Roman Catholic Church and by major figures like Charles Gille and two others that I'm going to talk about in one moment. And you can kind of see also their dueling priorities in the literary journals that they produced. Le Terroir was produced by the regionalists, and you see it's published by the École littéraire of Montreal. And Le Nigog, which means harpoon, was published by the exotistes. And Le Terroir, obviously evoking that sense of the land that was so important to Quebec writers, or to many Quebec writers, not all. Not everyone was on board with this, with a regionalism that sort of romanticized the Quebec rural experience. One of the most famous kind of anti-roman du terroir was Albert Laberge's La Squeen, which published in 1918, and it is about a family in rural Quebec, and speaks very plainly about the poverty and alcoholism, incest, and cruelty that were often features of rural life. One critic calls it a distorted mirror of the very, very, very famous Anne of Green Gables series, which I'm sure that many of you read as children and teenagers. And it's funny, and the La Squeen, so it's translated, the novel is translated as bitter bread, but there's a lot of debate on, even today, on like language forums on what squeen means. My understanding from what Laberge and others said, it's a word that he kind of made up. It doesn't have a particular meaning. It's meant to recall the smell of the main character. As a child, she would wet her bed and not be washed, and she would go to school and have this smell about her. And her classmates nicknamed her La Squeen. But some people argue, well, it relates to the French slang, a now antiquated slang word for prostitute, guine, in French, or saguine, which is a feminine version of monkey. But there's lots of arguments with some people saying, well, you're coming in with your ideas about standard French, and here in Montreal or Maine, there's some people from the northern US saying, no, like it's not those things. You're imposing your ideas of French on Canadian French. So there's still a lot of argument about what it means. But again, the English title is Bitter Bread, and it has been translated and it is available. But as I mentioned, these works were really in the minority. The majority was a focus on novels that, to a great extent, romanticized the Quebec rural experience, even as Quebec itself was becoming more urban. And again, I'm overgeneralizing because I don't want to be too unfair to this next figure. I'm going to talk about Kamiyawa, who was a cleric, and he was I'm going to say he was provost, but that's not correct, of Laval University in Quebec City for many years, and he wrote extensively on Canadian and Quebec literature. And I listed a few of his publications dating from around 1907 through to the late 30s. So he was very prolific. And you can see here, what I want you to focus on is he's talking about littérature canadienne, Canadian literature. So here he has it. This is from 1907, his essays, his history of Canadian literature in 1935. And then he also publishes works, this is just one example, but he has more than one, of littérature canadienne française, so French-Canadian literature. And he and other writers were using, these are the terms that they used when they were talking about Canadian literature, either in French, which is different from littérature québécoise. And so the littérature québécoise from the 60s was a real break with this idea that Canadian French literature was a part of Canadian literature in general, and Kamiyawa and others were pan-Canadianists. They did want to stand up for the rights of Quebec and the distinctive culture and language of Quebec, but they wouldn't maybe be calling for a separate Quebec, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So a huge influence, Kamiyawa, and also Henri Bourassa. He was more of a politician. He was again a pan-Canadianist who also felt strongly about protecting Quebec, and his ideas really dominated or were very much in play in Quebecois and Canadian politics through the early part of the 20th century. We're gonna jump ahead from these few decades of the 20th century through to the time around World War II and just after. And here you have Gabriel Roy, who was one of Quebec's best-known novelists. Margaret Atwood is among many of the Canadian writers who talk about being very influenced by her. And I have a cover here of one of her better-known novels, Bonheur d'Occasion, Secondhand Happiness, or it's translated in English as The Tin Flute. And she embraced a style of social realism that wasn't in favor with a lot of these regionalists from the Montreal School. And you can see here's a picture of the Carrier Theater, which is an important scene in her book, The Tin Flute. And Gabrielle on the right here with some children from the Saint-Henri neighborhood in 1945. The Tin Flute is set in the Saint-Henri neighborhood of Montreal. It was an area of, it was an industrial area, and also where there were the train, you can see New York, New Haven and Hartford line here, a kind of transit and shipping area, and represented really a large shift in Quebec, where, as in other places around North America, rapid industrialization continuing before and after World War II, and specifically in Quebec, people finding more opportunities in cities than they found in the countryside, but opportunities that were generally controlled by Anglophone, Protestant capital. So, the managers, and again, I'm very much overgeneralizing, but the management class was Anglophone and Protestant, and the working class was Francophone and Catholic. And we're going to, we're going to kind of shift to a little more chronological year by year approach, just because so much happens during the 50s and 60s as this status quo with a Francophone Quebecois Roman Catholic society that really isn't sharing in a lot of the economic power of and political power of the province. So just a little bit of political background before we move into that. So just before the end of World War II in 1944, Duplessis was the premier of Quebec, and he was challenged by two groups, neo-nationalists and neoliberals, and both rejected this idea of Quebec as a state that was connected to the Catholic Church, that should be considered primarily rural. And both were also ambivalent at best about the increased U.S. investment in Quebec, which had a lot of natural resources. But they were a little bit different in what they wanted for the future of Quebec. So the neo-nationalists, they both wanted a kind of a more secular and modern state, where more social services were provided by the state, and the state had more control over education and things like that, which were really controlled by the church. But the neo-nationalists really wanted that state to be run by and for the Francophone majority. And the neoliberals wanted a state that was run for everyone, that was that was maybe not as much about collective rights, but about individual rights. And again, this is a very, very kind of simple explanation of a lot of complex political ideas, but just to give you some sense of where we are as we move into this post-war period. So kind of on the political side, you have these neo-nationalists and neoliberals kind of clashing with Duplessis. But Duplessis was, also did want reforms for the Quebec state, as is so often the case, right? Everyone has a different idea about what reform should happen and how they should go. In 1948, you have the publication of Refus Global, or Total Refusal, originally created by a painter and then put into written form by the writer Claude Gavreau. And here you have the front cover of this publication, and you can see passion, or passion, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. And this was a rejection of kind of everything that I just talked about. In a way, the signatories of this manifesto wanted a different kind of society altogether. I'm just wanting to focus on a couple parts of this. This is just a very brief extract from this manifesto. So they're beginning by announcing who they are. Okay, the working class or petit bourgeois French Canadians, and they talk about how since the time of the arrival of French settlers or colonists in what's now, what's Quebec, they have really been controlled by the church. Okay, people clutching at the robes of priests, and really not allowed to get the education or information that they need. And they want to break with this and break with all of the conventions of society. We must break with the conventions of society once and for all. Okay, they reject U.S. investment in Quebec, and a lot of the industrialization that involves increased capitalization of Quebec, and they don't want to be servants of this economic project. And even more than that, at the very end, you see here, we reject all forms of intention, the two-edged perilous sword of reason, which if you think about surrealism in France, there's a lot of they were very much influenced by the surrealists, and surrealism shares a couple, especially with this rejection of intention and reason, and the works of André Breton and other surrealists in France. They also they want to use the unconscious and other forces to live a more full and meaningful existence that's not tied to reason or to work or to a lot of the social structures that are in place. So you have that in 1948. And then in 1950, you have the founding of Cité Libre, or Free City, a journal of social and political criticism. And this was, you might recognize here, I tried to find a picture of him in the 50s, but this is from 1965. This is Pierre Fudo, the father of the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. You can see him here. He's writing about functional politics. And Cité Libre was one of the many publications and ideas that was calling for reforms in Quebec. The reforms I talked about a moment ago, a state where education, health, social functions were run by the state, a modern secular state, and that they, even though the ideas in Cité Libre were perhaps different from the ideas in Total Refusal, one thing that I think in some ways is similar is the determination with which these ideas are put forth. So you see here at the top, the règles du jeu, okay, the rules of the game written by the editorial team. And then at the bottom here, faites vos jeux, place your bets, and flèches de tout bois. There's just arrows, literally arrows of all woods or from all types of wood, but would translate as by any means necessary. So they're really setting out assertively, like, we want this, place your bets, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen by any means necessary. So these waves of or ideas of reform from different quarters are becoming more and more obvious and prominent. In 1953, and this is less on the political side, more on the literary side, you have the founding of the Hexagon, which was a publishing house, and this is their first issue, The Sang, Two Bloods, with Gaston. You can see the name on the side here, Gaston Miron, who was one of the more prominent poets of the 50s, and this. And you have a couple of things happening. You have more money being put into culture and arts from Quebec. This is becoming more of a priority to invest in culture from Quebec or cultural products. And in the case of L'Hexagone, the poets who founded this magazine were among the first to be influenced by other Canadian poets, where, you know, France had been such a dominant influence, and the US as well, for a long time. And these influences don't go away. But the founders of l'Hexagone were very much influenced by the generation of poets who came before them, such as Alain Grandbois. And this is a little bit of a new development. And another factor in this increased awareness of what it meant to be Quebecois and what was littérature québécoise. And in 1960, you have La Révolution Tranquille, or the Quiet Revolution, and where, following the death of Duplessis, the Liberal Party in Quebec, with its leader Jean Lesage, forms a majority government in the province. And you might think, well, why do I have this picture of an electrical substation on the screen? So this is the Jean Lesage substation, but I have this picture as a kind of one of the many things that many changes that come about with the Révolution Tranquille, or the Quiet Revolution. The creation of Hydro-Québec, or like the state buys up private electrical companies, and electricity, and part of which is hydroelectricity, is now run by the state. And there is, sorry, let me just take a look at my notes here. I lost my place. Oh, let's see. There's a huge shift in what is controlled by the Catholic Church and what is controlled by the state. The state takes control of educational and social functions. Thousands of new jobs in the new government bureaucracy are created for middle class Francophone Quebecois. And there's a major increase in literary production. It triples during this decade, and a real shift in this sense that, yes, we are a modern, secular, and socialist state. This is Quebec, and we are going to really break from this Roman Catholic and agricultural past. Not to say that, you know, agricultural production went away or was no longer important. But it still represented a shift in the way people thought. And in 1961, I don't know what happened to my picture here, the creation of the Ministry of Cultural Affairs, which I think today is called the Ministry of Culture and Communication, which was the first such ministry in North America, actually, and really had a lot of power through grants and other financial support for the creation of ballet companies, theater companies, publishing houses in Quebec, and that really raised the prominence and quantity of works that were published and productions that were put on. It was specifically in French. And of course, we get back to Parti Pris. So it was first published in 1963. Position taken is how you might translate that. And you can see here in this first issue, they're laying out their perspective, right? From revolt to revolution. And here they're referring to the the Premier Duplessis, from the ideas of Duplessis to the Quebec Liberation Front. So you have the ideas of secession starting to come up, and towards a total revolution. So they're pretty. Their ideas are in a way different from those of Cité Libre, but they are equally determined. And they were heavily influenced by philosophers like Sartre and I put a little quote from Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher, that was especially important among the founders of Parti Pris. To name is to show, and to show is to change. And as I talked about earlier, they're really putting a name to this littérature québécoise, Quebecois literature. It's not Canadian literature, it's not French Canadian literature or Canadian French literature, it's Quebecois literature. And an idea that, as we'll see in the next series, becomes maybe more controversial than it was in the 60s. So for them, naming all of these things was part of changing them. And another major aspect of Parti Pris and the types of literary production that were, or the types of works that were being published in the 60s, had to do with cheval. And what is that? So if you look at this, the French word for horse, cheval, and you have the phonetic transcription here, cheval. It's kind of, and you have two parts, right? Kind of two syllables, and you have this sh sound. Cheval is was a representation of the Quebecois and specifically Montreal pronunciation of the word cheval. So cheval becomes cheval, and this becomes the language, or the name for this whole dialect, which wasn't limited to Montreal, but was especially connected to the working class of Montreal. And it was, really denigrated as an inferior form, and criticized for its dropping of things. So for example, you have in standard French, ce n'est pas, it's not, or it is not. In cheval, this becomes c'est pas. Okay. And you had a lot of anglicisms. Dumper would be to dump, either to dump something, like literally in the garbage, or in the way that's also used in American English and Canadian English, to dump someone, a boyfriend or girlfriend. You had les States for the US. And the boundaries here are very, very blurry. I hear like les States is used in France, and today in contemporary spoken French all the time. Dropping or eliding are features of all languages, and they're certainly a part of standard French. So what is cheval and what isn't it's always hard to say. Languages are so fluid and flexible. This is just a basic sense of what people are talking about when they're talking about cheval. And for people in 1960s Quebec, it was very serious, because it was a way that that people who spoke this primarily working class dialect were labeled as inferior. So you had works being published entirely in cheval. So in 1964, Le Cassé, which is often translated as Broke City. And this is just a little extract from it, and you can see here. So for example, where did I go? Mouais is moi, or me. Okay, there's a lot of vulgarities. This is a vulgarity. This cochon, like a female pig. This tabernacle, you might recognize as a common Quebecois swear word. So, and this was something that had not been seen before. There hadn't been written works in cheval, and there was or theatrical works. Michel Tremblay, also in the mid-60s, wrote a play that was performed entirely in cheval. And so these were new ways of making the Quebecois identity known and felt. Of course, it's always more complicated than it seems, because a lot of the people who were writing for Parti Pris and such, they really came more from the from the bourgeoisie class than the working class. But that gets, we don't have, that's a little too complicated for us to get into today, like who claims what territory. So, and with this with the politicization of language, you also have in the political sphere in general a real movement toward secession. So in 1968, the founding of the Parti Quebecois under René Lévesque. This poster is actually from '74, but the party was founded in '68, and excuse me. Part of the part of all the push for a stronger and sometimes even separate Quebecois identity was the passing of the Official Languages Act in 1969, which makes English and French, of course, Canada's official languages, and creates a commission to oversee the implementation of this act. Back on the literary front, you have the very famous Nuit de la Poésie in 1970 in Montreal, on March 27th, 1970. And one of the main features of the program is a reading of the poem Speak White. And here you have the poem's author, Michel Lalonde, reading her poem at the Nuit de la Poésie. I have just a little extract of it here. It's readily available online. And Speak White, it was a kind of jeer or insult that was directed toward French Canadians who were heard speaking French in public or choosing not to speak English. And I'll talk about the poem a little bit, and then I'll talk more about this idea of Speak White. So she's saying, you Anglophones, you're telling us to speak white, and it's lovely to hear you talk about Paradise Lost, or here to talk with the accents of Milton and Byron and Shelley and Keats. So you're telling us, we need to speak white. We need to speak in the language of Shakespeare. You're saying, we're a people without a culture. Nous sommes un peuple inculte. And, oops, sorry. And then there's also a political dimension to this, and I've skipped a large part of the poem here. But here she brings up more political ideas. Speak white. Tell us again about freedom and democracy. We know that liberty is a Black word, just like poverty is Black. And and she's talking about how she's referring to the Algerian Revolution, which was in the late '60s, and of course the integration of Little Rock in Arkansas. So there is a lot of these poets and writers are making a direct connection between Speak White and the prejudice that Francophone Quebecois face, and the prejudice that's faced by Black people in the United States or other people of color, who are under other colonial regimes elsewhere, and specifically with this idea, linking specifically with this idea of a racial prejudice for which is today, looking at it today, I don't know how that would be received. Like, it's very, to me anyway, it seems very complicated. How, are they, in what ways are they similar? The plight of Francophones in Quebec and of African Americans in the United States, or also in Canada. Around this time, there were about 15,000 Black Canadians in Montreal, but their needs really weren't so deeply addressed by the writers of Parti Pris and other other literary or political literary organizations. And I don't have a good answer to this, but I think it's an important question to think about, especially, you know, especially as we move forward into the 21st century and we see a Quebec that is more racially and ethnically diverse. And, you know, and they were, you know, as I mentioned, they were very much influenced by Sartre, but also by Frantz Fanon. And if you're taking our existentialist seminar with Wendy right now, you might be reading the works of Fanon, who is writing about black skin and white masks, is one of his most famous works. So, you know, where is this intersection between these different types of oppression, and how do we understand them? And I think it's a very complicated but very fascinating concept, and I think it's really important for people to understand it and to know how should we work, how can we work together. And I wanted to kind of one last little literary facet here. So this was 1970, the Nuit de la Poésie, the poem was also published in 1974. And then in 1976, you have the publication for what many say is Canada's first novelist by a First Nations woman. Je suis une maudite sauvagesse, or I am a damned savage woman, by Anne Antoine Capèche, who often went by the French name Anne André. And it was published in a bilingual edition, French and Innu. And the Innu people, and their word for themselves means human being. And I think this, you know, this is also a very much underrepresented literature in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and today. And I'm going to talk more about that in the third part of the series. And we're going to end around 1980 when you have the failed referendum on Quebec independence. So throughout the 70s and 80s, right, there is momentum gaining toward this separating and becoming an independent nation state, separate from Canada. It doesn't work, and Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau, who is by this time Prime Minister, is strongly against Quebec separatism. And they'll try again in the early 90s, and we'll get to that in a little bit. And so we're going to end here with a real turning point for Quebec identity and Quebec literature, and pick it up next time in the last part of the 20th century, and then moving into the 21st century. So I hope that's given you a little overview of just some of the many complex questions of what is Quebecois literature and what does it mean to be Quebecois. So let me close the presentation and take questions. Okay, let me just open up my interface here. All right.
Okay, hi Melanie.
Hi Anne.
Okay, that was fantastic. That was so interesting. I learned a lot. The first, we have a couple questions coming in. The first two are comments. The first is from Christine Lingvari, and she's simply saying that this is a particularly appropriate topic because we just had the 50th anniversary of the War Measures Act. And do you want to say anything about the War Measures Act now, is for those who may not know what happened?
That is not, I'm aware of it, but it's not it's not an area of expertise for me.
Well, it was a big deal, and maybe somebody more knowledgeable of that period can write us a comment that I can read back. The next comment, and maybe this is Brigitte Rivard from Ottawa. Hello, Brigitte. And she may be able to respond here. She's letting us know that Gabrielle Roy was actually born in Manitoba, but she did, you know, not Quebec born, but she did write Tin
Yeah,
Flute.
that's true. You know, and I forgot to say that. I'm sorry. I totally forgot to mention that. She was born in Manitoba and she studied in France. And so that is part of what, you know, what makes this topic so complex, is, you know, and it gets back to this question put forth by Kamiyawa, the cultural critic, who's really coming at this from a Canadian Française approach as opposed to a Quebecois approach. Like what? So so her, you know, the Tin Flute is set in Montreal, but yeah, she was from Manitoba, and you know, what does that? So what does that mean to be Quebecois? Like where would somebody like Gabrielle Roy fit in, right? If um, and I think that's why, you know, this idea of a littérature québécoise, maybe it's not, um, yeah, it leaves a lot of loopholes, you know, and how do we, like, what do we make of those loopholes, and how do you, you know, because how do you characterize literature in French from other places? Because of course, you know, in Manitoba, there was a really strong, um, you know, a substantial minority, but still a lot of French speakers in New Brunswick as well, and what was Acadia, you know, so they're writing in French, but not necessarily, and they might even have works that are set in Quebec or be writing about Quebec, but they're not Quebecois.
Yeah, so the question, can you become Quebecois? You know, I have a daughter and son-in-law who lived in Quebec and read perfectly bilingual, but it was a place they never felt they could. I mean, they're still there, but do you want to say something about the notion of pure laine and what it means, either if you were francophone living outside of Quebec or you are a francophone living inside Quebec, but you don't go back many generations that have come directly from France? Can you become Quebecois? If you're from Haiti or you're from Italy or you're from China.
Do you want to know my personal opinion or
Just no, well, you know, whatever you know about how people in Quebecois arts and Quebec arts view that subject of identity.
I mean, I think, and you know, I think we'll see this next week with a response poem to Speak White. There's a poem called Speak What? And you know, a lot of the writers from the 90s and then the 21st century are saying, well, yeah, you can become Quebecois. It's not only those who were descendants of these French colonists. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about her next time, but she was born in Canada, but has spent a lot of her life in the US. She's a professor at Georgetown University in Washington, DC, and she focuses on the 21st century Quebecois literature. And especially there's a couple of writers from Vietnam who write in French, and who are really a major part of the Quebecois literary scene right now. There's also, you know, and I think, and there's also, for example, you have Jacques I didn't have time to talk about him today, but Jacques Poulan and his novel Volkswagen Blues, which is kind of a road novel in the tradition of Kerouac, Jack Kerouac, who himself had you know, French Canadian background, and writing this great American road novel. And in Volkswagen Blues, the characters are going to the U.S. They kind of are exploring what it means to be Quebecois. So I'll put that in the chat here, Volkswagen Blues,
Okay. So
which is,
Christine
sorry, go ahead.
Yengvari, she's come back with a couple things. One, she's saying, no, you cannot become pure laine, only descendants of original immigrants, another big issue in Quebec. But I guess there is a difference between pure laine, which is referring to direct descendants, and being part of Quebec culture. She also comments on, was asking about, it says in the revolution was the FLQ, which was the Liberation Front of Quebec, was looking for liberty. They kidnapped Pierre Laporte. This was a government minister, and executed him. And James Cross, the British envoy, there were bombings, and the army was called out to Quebec. And that was Trudeau's decision to do that, and it's still considered very controversial. And she said it was tumultuous times. So I don't know if you were living in Quebec at that time, Christine. That was interesting. And let's see what else there is here.
I guess, I don't know, and well, yeah, and I was really focusing more on the literature part, but you know, happy to hear from Christine more about the what she thinks. I guess, Christine, are you saying like it was the common conception? I guess what do you mean when you say no, you cannot become pure laine? And this is pure wool. I guess I don't know. I personally am not so attached to these ideas of purity, because I think we saw in the, you know, in the first in the first series, you know, the people who from France who came from France came from all over, well, mostly northern France and parts of western France, but they themselves, they didn't always share a common language. You know, I think ideas of purity are maybe gloss over a whole lot of complication in history, but that's my own personal view.
She writes back now, pure laine is real Quebecois. US immigrants just don't cut it. Or us immigrants. I guess she means us immigrants. So, and I guess she includes herself as one of those who is not considered legitimate.
Right.
It does seem that even when it was contrary, politics and literature had been closely linked for generations, whether it was for or against or for something new. And even that first group you mentioned that didn't want to have to do with politics, it was still making, in a sense, a political statement, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. That refus global was a political statement, you know, in rejecting, you know, being part of the entire, all of what the political system stood for and was working toward, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too. Are people still saying that francophones from other parts of Canada, there is a distinction between them, if you come from New Brunswick or Manitoba or somewhere else, and those from Quebec?
I mean, I think some people
in a bookstore, on the bookshelf, there would be Quebecois literature, and then somewhere else it would be the rest of Canada. Christine's saying yes. Let's see what Brigitte says. Brigitte says, okay, would you say that the Durham report, even so many years before, is the root of the refus global and the interest for a distinct culture?
you know, in some ways, I think you could say yes, because the Durham report, you know, again, that famous line about a people with no literature and no language. And I think the people who signed the Refus Global manifesto, let me back up. So Durham is saying this, right, because it's for him, it's these French-speaking people who have been separated from Mother France and are kind of without a culture within this larger Anglophone and British English culture. And the Refus Global people were, you know, they were rejecting a lot of other things, like reason and intention, and they, and again, as I mentioned, they were interested in surrealism in a way that, like Durham would, you know, was definitely, there wasn't a concept, right, of surrealism when Durham was writing. But I think when he says they're without a literature and a culture, I think you could argue that the Refus Global people are saying, well, you know, it's not the there's like the American influence, right, and capitalism and other things. They are what is erasing our culture and our potential. They talk a lot about human potential. I do see, I didn't think about that before, but I do see a possible connection there.
There's a question here from Elizabeth Smith, and I see we're getting close to time, so if you have a last question, you can try to enter it now. Elizabeth is wondering about Roch Carrier and La Guerre, and then she says, yes, sir. I don't know what yes, sir is.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Quebec to the wars.
La Guerre, yes, sir. Yeah, I didn't have time to, you know, these are just really overviews, right? And I have to skip over so many things, but I will have a list of recommended reading, and also the Encyclopedia Britannica, their entry on Canadian literature and French is great if you want to make a list for yourself. It has a lot, but yeah, that's La Guerre, yes, sir. And in both World War I and World War II, there were many, including Bourassa and others, who were really opposed to the Canadian participation in these two wars. They opposed conscription in especially in World War I. Didn't feel that these wars were in Quebec's interest. And I did have something else I wanted to say about La Guerre, yes, sir. Let's see here. Where was it in my notes?
While you're looking that up, Melanie, here's a note from Brigitte. It says, for some people, only French people born in Quebec are Quebecois, but they are also quick to acknowledge people with French names as Quebecois, as we all do Gabriois, but they do not include Mordecai Richler as Quebecois.
Yeah, there's a lot of categorization. And why can't I find, oh, sorry, I cannot find what I wanted to say about.
So while you're doing that, I'll just tell a funny story. When I had a group in Quebec City, we were led by a guy named Jean-Paul Harney. His father was Irish, his mother was Quebecoise, and he was in Quebec French culture, and he came home one day and he very proudly told his mother that he beat up the English kids on the playground. And the mother said, you know, Jean-Paul, do you realize your father is English? And he said, no. I mean, he was shocked. It was no, not, c'est pas possible. He had no idea that he carried that division right within himself.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not, you know, it's not an experience that I personally have, but I feel like it would be, I think it's a type of division that will be addressed a lot in the 21st century that we're coming up, because there's just more of that, you know, just as like littérature québécoise was coming to the fore in the 60s and 70s. Now we have this kind of maybe a more fluid interpretation. And there are some, and then as Brigitte or said, there are some people who would really reject this interpretation for a more fluid Quebecois identity, and some who wouldn't.
I think we're out of questions. There are a number of people just thanking you, but I think that's the end of the questions.
All right. Well, thank you everyone so much. I will be including there's a follow-up email that has the recording and the further reading, and we'll be back with part 3 next week. And if you did, he belongs more to the 21st century, but I did want to, you want a Quebecois who's from India originally, as a comedian. A lot of you may know him, called Sammy Sugar. Do you know Sammy Sugar, Anne?
Sorry?
Do you know Sammy Sugar?
No.
No? Okay, you can find a lot of his videos on YouTube. He does like a lot of bilingual sets. He performs all over well, not right now, but he performs all over North America and in France. He uses a lot of obscenities, so if you're not into that in your comedy, don't check him out. But I think he's very funny, and he addresses both the kind of tension between French-speaking Canada and France, and this very complicated idea of Quebecois identity. So thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Again, welcome back to our series. Any questions about classical pursuits or worldwide quest, we're always here by phone or email. And we'll thank you, Anne, so much for being part of the Q&A, and we'll see everybody next week.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.